The porch light flickered against the first snow of December as I stood frozen in my own kitchen dish towel, still in my hand, staring at the man I'd shared a bed with for 17 years. He hadn't asked. He hadn't even paused long enough to gauge my face before he said it like he was telling me the caterer changed the menu. Behind him, the oven timer beeped for the cookies I'd never take out in time. I remember thinking quite clearly that something in our marriage had just tilted, and I hadn't been given a vote. "My ex is joining us for Christmas dinner." Ryan said it the way he might mention a change in the weather forecast. Casual, final. He didn't look up from his phone when he said it, just kept scrolling with his thumb like the sentence hadn't just detonated in the middle of our kitchen. I set the dish towel down slowly, giving myself a second to make sure I'd heard him right. "I'm sorry, what?" "Claire, she's back in Ohio. She doesn't really have family close by, and I thought it'd be nice." He finally glanced up, and there was nothing in his expression that suggested he understood the weight of what he'd just said. "You remember Claire?" I remembered Claire the way you remember a scar. Not something you think about daily, but something your fingers find anyway out of habit when you're not paying attention. Claire Bennett, Ryan's girlfriend from college 4 years on and off before I ever came into the picture. I'd heard her name more times in the first 2 years of our marriage than I cared to count. Ryan used to talk about her the way people talk about a version of their youth they can't quite let go of. Claire loved concerts. Claire was fearless. Claire once talked her way past a bouncer in Cleveland using nothing but charm. I'd smiled through those stories for years, telling myself it was harmless nostalgia. That's what you do early on. You give people the benefit of the doubt because the alternative is exhausting. "You already invited her," I said. Not a question. A confirmation, because some part of me needed to hear him admit it out loud. "I mean, yeah, I ran into her a few weeks ago. She just moved back. It felt wrong not to. 17 years of marriage, and my husband had decided alone in some conversation I wasn't part of that his ex-girlfriend belonged at our family table on the one night of the year I worked hardest to make feel like ours. Not his family's, not the neighborhood's, ours. I wanted to ask him 100 things. Why now? Why her? Why he felt the need to make this decision without so much as a text message to warn me. Instead, I watched him check his reflection in the dark kitchen window, smoothing down his collar. And I understood that this conversation had never actually been about whether I was okay with it. Then he said the thing that told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in his priorities that night. "Just don't embarrass me, okay? Don't ask her weird questions. Don't bring up the past. And for God's sake, don't do the jealous wife thing." The jealous wife thing. I have spent 17 years building a life with this man. I raised his mother's spirits through her cancer scare. I sat in a folding chair at his father's funeral, holding his hand while he sobbed into my shoulder. I worked 2 jobs the year he got laid off so we wouldn't lose the house. And the concern on his face that December evening wasn't for me. It was for how I might make him look in front of a woman he hadn't seen in years. I smiled. It came easier than I expected. "Of course," I said. Ryan visibly relaxed, like I'd just signed off on something. He kissed my forehead, an afterthought the way you might pat a dog on your way out the door, and went back to his phone, already texting, already somewhere else in his head. What Ryan didn't know was that I'd learned about Claire's return to Ohio 3 weeks before he ever mentioned her name. What Ryan didn't know was that Claire wasn't spending a lonely Christmas at all. She wasn't a woman with no family nearby, quietly grateful for an invitation out of pity. She was engaged. To a man named Daniel Foster. And more importantly, I'd already spoken to Daniel myself. I'd met him at a fundraiser 3 weeks earlier, the kind of event where you make small talk over bad wine and worse hors d'oeuvres, and somewhere between the silent auction and the coat check he'd mentioned his fiancé's name. I hadn't reacted the way most people would expect. I hadn't gasped or gone pale. I'd simply filed the information away the way you file away anything that might matter later. And now, 4 days before Christmas, my husband had just handed me an opportunity I hadn't even had to build myself. That night, after Ryan fell asleep beside me, breathing slow and even entirely unaware that his tidy little plan had just become something else entirely, I picked up my phone and opened a new message thread. I typed, "Daniel, the invitation still stands. Christmas, 6 o'clock. I watched the 3 dots appear almost instantly. He'd been waiting. "I'll be there." I set the phone face down on the nightstand, pulled the blanket up over my shoulder, and lay in the dark, beside the man who had just told me not to embarrass him. I had absolutely no intention of embarrassing him. I simply intended to let the truth do that on its own. To understand why Claire's name still had the power to tighten something in my chest after all these years, you have to understand what our marriage actually looked like from the inside, not the version Ryan told at dinner parties. I met Ryan Walker when I was 26 working at a marketing firm in Columbus, and he had this way of making a room feel smaller and warmer just by walking into it. He remembered small details about people, your coffee order, the name of your childhood dog, the fact that you hated cilantro. He made me feel in those early months like I was the most interesting person he'd ever spoken to. It's a particular kind of magic being looked at like that. I understand now that it's also a skill, one Ryan has always had, and one he's used more than once on more than one woman. Claire existed in our relationship long before I ever met her, a shadow cast over conversations at odd moments. She and Ryan had dated for 4 years in college, serious enough that his mother still kept a photo of the two of them at some formal dance tucked in an old album. Claire was the one who moved to Chicago for a job in finance, chose her career over whatever future she and Ryan might have built together. Ryan told the story in a way that always positioned him as the one left behind, the one who'd loved harder. For years, small comparisons slipped into ordinary conversation. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to and call cruel. Just little threads woven so consistently into the fabric of our marriage that I stopped noticing them individually. Claire used to love skiing, he'd say, watching me struggle on a beginner's slope in Colorado. Claire was always so good with people, he'd mention after I'd gone quiet at one of his work functions, exhausted from smiling at strangers all night. Claire would have understood what I meant, he said once during an argument so unremarkable I don't even remember what started it. Each comment alone meant nothing. Strung together across 17 years, they became something else entirely. A quiet, persistent message that somewhere in my husband's mind, there existed a better version of a wife, and her name was Claire. I am not by nature a jealous person. I built a career of my own in operations management, something I was good at and proud of. I nursed Ryan through unemployment, through his father's death, through 2 herniated discs that kept him out of work for months. I paid half the mortgage every single month for 17 years. Whatever else was true, I had never once given him reason to doubt my commitment. About 2 months before that December, things started shifting in ways I couldn't quite name at first. Ryan started going to the gym more 4 mornings a week instead of his usual sporadic Saturday visits. He switched cologne, something sharper, more expensive that I didn't recognize on our bathroom shelf. His phone, which had always sat screen up on the kitchen counter, started appearing face down deliberately like a small, unconscious confession. His client dinners began running later, stretching from an hour to 2, then sometimes 3. One night in early November, I was walking past his phone, charging on the nightstand, when a notification lit the screen. Claire. It felt like old times. I didn't confront him that night. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. I didn't scream, didn't wake him up demanding answers, didn't throw his phone across the room the way television would have you believe every wronged wife behaves. I stood there in the dark, reading those 5 words over and over, and I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I decided I needed to understand what I was actually looking at before I destroyed 17 years of marriage over a single text message. Over the following weeks, quietly and without confrontation, I pieced together that Ryan had met Claire at least 4 times since her return to Columbus. Coffee here, a walk through the park there, one dinner he'd told me was with a potential client named Steve, from a company that, as it turned out, didn't exist under that name in any of his work files. But here is the detail that matters most. The twist that makes this story different from the ordinary tale of a suspicious wife hacking into her husband's accounts. I never once looked through Ryan's phone. I never installed tracking software, never demanded his passwords, never stooped to the kind of surveillance that would have made me feel small, even if it confirmed my fears. The truth found me by accident at a fundraiser I'd almost skipped that November evening. I was standing near the silent auction table when a man introduced himself. Daniel Foster, mid-50s owner of a small chain of hardware stores across central Ohio, easy laugh, kind eyes. Somewhere in the conversation, making the kind of small talk strangers make at these events, he mentioned that his fiancé had just relocated back to the area. Claire Bennett, he said, beaming with the particular pride of a man recently engaged. I felt something settle into place, cold and clear like ice forming on a window. We kept talking carefully, both of us circling something neither wanted to name outright. Daniel mentioned that Claire had been reconnecting with an old college friend lately, someone she'd known years ago, nothing to worry about. He'd said, though something in his voice suggested he'd said that phrase to himself more than once. How old of a friend, I finally asked. 4 years, I think she said, college. I set my wine glass down carefully on the table between us. She dated my husband for 4 years. The silence that followed said more than either of us could have managed with words. Two strange strangers standing at a fundraiser, realizing simultaneously that the people they loved had been telling them two very different versions of the same story. Neither Daniel nor I jumped to conclusions that night at the fundraiser. I think that restraint is what made everything that followed feel less like revenge and more like simple accountability. And it's important I explain that clearly, because it would have been easy, almost satisfying in a bitter sort of way, to assume the worst immediately and burn everything down out of spite. Daniel told me, standing there with his half-finished glass of wine, that Claire had never given him a single reason to doubt her before. She was steady, he said, reliable, in a way that made him trust her completely. I believed him, because I recognized something in the careful way he defended her, the same instinct I'd had for years defending Ryan against my own quiet suspicions, telling myself I was imagining things that 17 years of marriage had earned him the benefit of the doubt. We exchanged numbers that night, agreeing almost formally to simply compare notes. Not to accuse, not yet. Over the next several days, through careful, unhurried conversation, Daniel and I began laying our separate timelines side by side, and the picture that emerged wasn't built on assumptions or stolen evidence. It was built entirely on what Ryan and Claire had each told us themselves in their own words on their own time. The dates started aligning in ways that were hard to explain away. The evening Ryan told me he had a late meeting with a client in Dublin, Claire had told Daniel she was catching up with an old friend in Dublin. The night Ryan said his meeting ran until 10, Claire came home to Daniel just after 10:30, cheeks still flushed from the cold, smelling faintly of a coffee shop, instead of the office dinner she claimed. Small things, individually forgivable, together unmistakable. But it was Daniel who uncovered the detail that changed everything for me, the one that turned quiet suspicion into genuine anger. Ryan had told Claire that our marriage was, in his words, basically over. He'd described me as someone he shared a house with more than a life. He implied we functioned more like roommates who happened to still sleep in the same bed. He'd gone so far as to suggest that I already knew he was considering divorce, that it was simply a matter of time and logistics before we made it official. None of that was true, not one word of it. At home during those same weeks, Ryan and I had been discussing a kitchen renovation for spring. We'd booked a vacation rental in Michigan for July. We still fell asleep most nights with his hand resting on my hip, an old habit from early in our marriage that had somehow survived 17 years intact. Whatever version of our marriage Ryan was describing to Claire, it wasn't the one I was living in. Meanwhile, Claire had been keeping her own secret from Ryan, one just as significant. She hadn't told him she was engaged. When Daniel gently pressed her weeks later about why she hadn't mentioned Ryan's return into her life, Claire had offered an explanation that struck me as almost clinical. In its calculation, she said Ryan was emotionally fragile about their shared history, and she didn't want to upset him by mentioning her engagement so soon after reconnecting. I began to understand what we were actually looking at. Two people who had once loved each other, each now handing their current partner a carefully edited version of the truth, testing some old unfinished feeling, without either of them having the courage to name it out loud. Daniel wanted to confront them immediately. He was angry, rightfully so, and there's a particular kind of fury that comes from realizing you've been lied to by someone you trusted completely. I understood the impulse. I felt it too, sitting across from him at a diner one gray afternoon, watching him turn his coffee cup slowly in his hands. But I asked him to wait. If we confront them separately, I said, they'll have time to rewrite the story before we ever hear the truth. Daniel didn't like it, but he agreed. We both understood without needing to say it outright that whatever came next needed to happen in a way neither Ryan nor Claire could control or soften. And then Ryan handed me the perfect opportunity himself without any prompting on my part. 3 days after that conversation with Daniel, Ryan came home and announced almost proudly that Claire would be joining us for Christmas dinner. He hadn't asked my permission. He hadn't even framed it as a discussion. He described her as a woman facing a lonely holiday, someone with no family nearby, someone who deserved a little kindness during the season. I nearly laughed out loud at the kitchen table. Claire had a fiancé, a man who loved her, who had already bought a ring, who had every intention of building a life with her. And Ryan had absolutely no idea. That evening, once the house had gone quiet, I called Daniel. Ryan invited Claire to Christmas dinner, I told him, at our house, 6 o'clock Christmas Day. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind that carries weight. Would you like to join us? I asked. I heard him exhale slowly, something settling into resolve. I wouldn't miss it, he said. The days leading up to Christmas passed in a strange suspended calm, the kind that settles over a house right before something breaks. Ryan hummed while he strung lights along the porch railing. He seemed lighter than he'd been in months, humming old songs under his breath, whistling while he shoveled the driveway, and I understood exactly why, even as he thought I understood nothing at all. The morning of Christmas Eve, he actually asked me something resembling a question. You're not going to make tonight weird, right? I looked up from the stuffing I was preparing, wooden spoon still in my hand, and gave him the calmest smile I could manage. Ryan, I promise you, I'm going to be perfectly polite. He seemed satisfied with that, which told me everything about how little he understood the woman he'd been married to for 17 years. By 4 o'clock on Christmas Day, the house was full in the particular way it always was for the holidays. Warm, a little chaotic, smelling of roasted turkey and cinnamon. Ryan's mother arrived first, followed by his sister and her husband. Then our 2 grown children, home from college and graduate school. Then a neighbor we'd invited most years out of long habit and genuine affection. 10 people total gathered in a living room, strung with lights I'd hung myself, around a table set with the same china I'd used every Christmas since we bought this house. Ryan had spent an unusual amount of time getting ready that afternoon. New sweater, cologne I recognized now as the expensive kind he'd started wearing 2 months earlier. He checked his reflection in the hallway mirror 3 separate times before 5 o'clock, and I watched him do it without saying a word. At 5:55 the doorbell rang. Claire stood on our porch in a red wool coat holding a bottle of Cabernet, her cheeks pink from the cold. Ryan reached the door before I did, and the hug they shared lasted a beat longer than any greeting between old friends should reasonably last. I watched his hand linger against her back. I watched her laugh at something he murmured near her ear. He turned to the room and introduced her with a warmth he hadn't shown introducing anyone else all evening. This is Claire, one of the most important people from my past. My mother-in-law's eyebrows rose slightly. My daughter shot me a confused glance across the room. I simply smiled and offered Claire a glass of wine. Dinner began, and Ryan and Claire fell into an easy rhythm of shared memories, college stories, neither of them bothered translating for the rest of the table. Inside jokes, names of people none of us knew. At one point, Ryan leaned back in his chair laughing and mentioned a trip they'd taken together to Vermont years earlier. "Best Christmas I ever had," he said, still smiling, not thinking before the words left his mouth. The table went quiet for exactly 1 beat too long. I watched something shift across Ryan's face as he realized what he'd just said out loud at his own dinner table in front of his wife of 17 years. "Before I met Emma, obviously," he added quickly. Claire laughed a little too brightly, reaching for her wine glass. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Everyone at that table had heard exactly what they'd heard. At 6:24 the doorbell rang a second time. Ryan frowned, glancing toward the hallway. "Are we expecting someone else?" I set my fork down carefully beside my plate. "I am," I said, and rose from my chair. I walked to the door with a steadiness that surprised even me, given how hard my heart was pounding beneath my sweater. I opened it to find Daniel standing on the porch in a dark winter coat, a bottle of wine in one hand and a small wrapped gift in the other, snow settling gently on his shoulders. He stepped inside, and I watched Claire's eyes find him from across the room. Her fork froze mid-air, suspended between her plate and her mouth. Daniel walked directly toward her, unhurried, entirely composed. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," he said, and leaned down to press a light kiss against her cheek. The entire table went silent. Not the brief, awkward silence from earlier, something heavier, more absolute, the kind of silence that fills a room right before it changes permanently. Ryan stared at the two of them, his expression shifting from confusion to something sharper. "Who's that?" he finally managed. Claire didn't answer. She couldn't. Daniel straightened, extending his hand toward Ryan with perfect, unhurried politeness. Daniel Foster. Ryan shook his hand automatically, still processing, still searching Claire's face for an explanation that wasn't coming. Then Daniel said the 6 words that ended the performance Ryan had been staging all evening. Claire's fiancé. Ryan's face went through several expressions in the space of about 3 seconds: confusion, disbelief, something that looked almost like physical pain, before he finally turned to Claire, his voice cracking on the word. Your what? Claire had gone the color of the tablecloth. Her wine glass sat forgotten beside her plate, condensation beating down its stem. Ryan, I can explain, she said, though nothing in her voice suggested she actually could. I returned to my seat with a calm I hadn't fully expected to feel, smoothing my napkin back across my lap, as though nothing unusual was happening at all. Around the table, 10 pairs of eyes moved between Ryan, Claire, and Daniel, waiting for someone to make sense of what had just unfolded in the middle of a family Christmas dinner. It was my mother-in-law who finally asked the question everyone was thinking. Ryan, she said, setting down her fork with deliberate precision, why wouldn't you know she was engaged? Ryan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Daniel pulled out the empty chair beside Claire and sat down without waiting to be invited, unbuttoning his coat with the same unhurried calm he'd shown at the door. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hand on the table or demand an explanation the way television might have taught us to expect. His composure was in many ways far more devastating than anger would have been. I'm curious, he said, looking at Claire, why the man you told me was an old friend from college didn't know you were engaged to be married. Ryan's eyes snapped toward me, understanding arriving all at once. You did this on purpose. I invited a woman's fiancé to Christmas dinner, I said evenly. Why would that be a problem, Ryan, unless there's something you'd like to explain to the table? I watched the words land. I watched him search for a way to twist the moment back into something he could control and find nothing. You told me not to embarrass you. I continued, keeping my voice level, almost gentle. I haven't. I've barely said a word all night. That silence stretched again, longer this time, broken only by the soft clink of my son setting down his glass. Ryan tried to recover, insisting Claire had simply misunderstood something, that whatever she believed about the state of our marriage was some kind of miscommunication, nothing more. Daniel turned to him with the same steady patience. Did you tell Claire your marriage was over? Every face at that table turned toward my husband. I heard for the first time directly from Claire's own mouth the confirmation I'd already suspected. Ryan had told her Emma had spoken to a divorce attorney, that the marriage existed in name only, that it was simply a matter of time before the paperwork caught up to what he'd already decided in his heart. I hadn't, I said quietly into the stunned quiet of the room. I've never spoken to a divorce attorney in my life. Ryan tried to argue that Claire had misread the situation, that his words had been taken out of context. And with each excuse, I watched something in his mother's expression harden a little further. But Claire wasn't entirely blameless either, and I want to be honest about that because it would have been easy to let her disappear into the role of victim. Daniel asked her directly why she'd kept her engagement a secret from Ryan for weeks. Claire's composure finally cracked. She admitted, voice shaking, that she and Ryan had been meeting quietly because she wanted to know whether there was still something unresolved between them. Some old feeling she'd never fully put to rest. Daniel let the silence sit for a long moment before he asked the question that mattered most. And was there? Claire didn't answer. The silence answered for her. I felt something settle inside me in that moment, a strange kind of clarity. I didn't need to know whether anything physical had happened between them. That question, which might have consumed another version of this story, felt almost beside the point. The betrayal for me had already occurred the moment Ryan chose to build a secret emotional life with another woman and tell her our marriage was already over. Ryan turned to me, his voice dropping, pleading now instead of defensive. Can we talk about this privately? I looked at him for a long moment before answering. No. Not out of cruelty, not to humiliate him further in front of his own mother and children, but because Ryan was the one who had brought Claire into this house, to this table, into the middle of my family's Christmas. He had made his private choices public first. I had simply made sure the truth arrived alongside the lie. You brought your lie to my Christmas table, Ryan. I said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. I only invited the truth. No one at that table said anything for a long moment. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of a neighbor's car pulling into their driveway, ordinary life continuing on, unaware of what had just collapsed in our dining room. Claire finally stood gathering her coat with trembling hands, murmuring apologies to no one in particular. Daniel rose without hurry, buttoning his coat back up, and paused beside my chair before he left. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for telling me the truth instead of leaving me the last one to find out." I nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment, and watched them both walk out into the cold together, not as a couple anymore, but as two people who owed each other and themselves an honest conversation. The house emptied slowly after that, relatives murmuring quiet goodbyes, my mother-in-law squeezing my hand at the door in a way that said more than words could have. By 9 o'clock it was just Ryan and me standing in a kitchen still cluttered with half-eaten pie and abandoned wine glasses, the wreckage of a holiday neither of us would forget. Ryan's anger had drained into something quieter, more desperate. He followed me from room to room as I cleared the table, his voice shifting from defensive to pleading with each passing minute. "Nothing happened between us, physically, I mean. I need you to know that." I kept stacking plates, not looking at him. "It was nostalgia," he continued. "Confusion, some kind of midlife stupidity, I don't even know what to call it. I never meant for it to go this far." I set the plates down carefully in the sink and finally turned to face him. If Daniel hadn't walked through that door tonight, I asked, "When exactly were you going to tell me?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. I watched him search for a version of the truth that might soften what he'd done and find nothing worth saying. I told him then something I'd been carrying quietly for weeks. I hadn't stumbled into that evening unprepared, hadn't simply reacted in the moment, out of some impulsive need for revenge. In the weeks since the fundraiser, I had quietly gathered copies of our shared financial records documents I had every legal right to access as his wife. I'd reviewed our joint assets, our retirement accounts, the equity we'd built in the house over 17 years. I'd scheduled a consultation with a family attorney, not to file anything hastily, but to understand exactly where I stood if the worst turned out to be true. I hadn't filed for divorce before Christmas because some part of me still wanted to give Ryan the chance to tell me the truth himself. I wanted to see whether he had the courage to sit across from me and be honest, rather than let me discover everything secondhand. He hadn't. So this whole dinner was a trap. Ryan asked, something bitter creeping into his voice, as though I were the one who owed an explanation. "No," I said. "It was an opportunity for you to tell the truth. You chose not to." In the days that followed, a separate story was unfolding in a house across town. Daniel ended his engagement to Claire almost immediately, a decision I learned about not through gossip, but through Claire herself, who called me nearly a week later, her voice raw and unsteady. She apologized haltingly, admitting that Ryan had spent weeks convincing her our marriage was cold, controlling essentially over in every way that mattered. She said she'd believed him, or wanted to believe him, because it made whatever she was feeling toward him easier to justify. I listened without interrupting, and when she finished, I told her something I believed with complete certainty. "Ryan lying to you doesn't erase the fact that you lied to Daniel." There was a long pause on the line before she agreed quietly, the fight gone out of her voice. "I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters more than the drama of that Christmas dinner itself. Claire and I never became enemies. We didn't trade accusations or build some prolonged rivalry out of what had happened. The truth was simpler, and in some ways sadder than that. Ryan was responsible for the choices Ryan made. Claire was responsible for the choices she made. Neither of us needed to carry the weight of the other's decisions, and somewhere in that recognition, whatever anger I might have held toward her began to soften into something closer to weary understanding. By the second week of January, I had made my decision. I told Ryan I wanted a separation effective immediately. He didn't fight it as hard as I expected. I think some part of him had already known, sitting in that kitchen on Christmas night, that there was no version of an apology substantial enough to undo what he'd done. He moved into a rented apartment across town within the month, taking his side of the closet, his father's old record collection, and very little else. The house suddenly belonged entirely to me. I remember the first Saturday morning after he left, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, the house utterly silent around me. No television murmuring from the other room, no sound of his footsteps overhead, just quiet, complete, and undisturbed, filling every corner of a house that had felt crowded with tension for months, without my fully realizing it. I braced myself for loneliness. I'd expected it to arrive quickly the way people warn you it will after decades of marriage suddenly end. It never came. What arrived instead slowly over the following weeks was something closer to relief. I found myself rearranging furniture I'd never liked but never mentioned. I repainted the guest room a color Ryan had vetoed years earlier. I started sleeping diagonally across the bed, an entire mattress suddenly unexpectedly mine. The silence that filled our house after Ryan left didn't feel like abandonment. It felt for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit like room to breathe. 8 months passed between that Christmas dinner and the moment I'm about to describe, and I think it's important to tell you honestly what happened in between, because life rarely resolves itself as neatly as we'd like it to. Ryan didn't lose his job. He didn't go bankrupt, didn't become some cautionary tale whispered about at family gatherings. Didn't wake up one morning to find the entire world had turned against him, the way revenge stories sometimes promise. His consequences were quieter than that and in some ways more honest. He lost his marriage. Not because fate punished him, not because some cosmic justice reached down and delivered what he deserved, but because of choices he made one after another over the course of several months, each one small enough to justify in the moment, and significant enough together to end 17 years. Our divorce proceeded with more civility than either of us expected, though not without its share of difficult weeks. There were moments of genuine grief on both sides. 17 years doesn't dissolve without leaving marks regardless of how it ends. Ryan reached out more than once during those early months, asking whether we might reconsider suggesting counseling, reminding me of the good years. And there had been many good years before all of this. I told him each time the same thing. I wasn't interested in going back. Not out of bitterness, not to punish him further than the situation already had, but because some part of me understood that trust, once it breaks in the particular way ours had, doesn't simply mend itself because enough time has passed or enough apologies have been offered. Daniel and Claire's engagement didn't survive that Christmas either, though I heard secondhand that they'd tried briefly to work through what had happened before ultimately deciding against it. Claire moved back to Chicago sometime in the spring, and I haven't heard from her since, though I find I don't carry any lingering resentment toward her. We were in the end 2 women who'd both been lied to by the same man in different ways at different times. Daniel and I didn't fall into some tidy romantic ending either, and I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to shape this story into something neater than the truth allows. We exchanged occasional messages over those months, checking in 2 people bound together by one strange, unforgettable evening. Eventually, that settled into something like friendship, not romance, just mutual respect between 2 people who understood exactly what the other had been through. Last month, I hosted Christmas again at the house nearly a full year after everything unraveled at that same table. Ryan wasn't there. The house looked much the same as it always had. The same tree stood in the corner of the living room, lights strung the way I'd always strung them. I made the same stuffing recipe I'd been perfecting for almost 2 decades, the one my mother taught me, the one that still tastes faintly of childhood kitchens and holidays long past. But something fundamental had shifted, something I felt the moment I set the last dish on the table and looked around at the people gathered there, my children, my sister, a few close friends who'd stood by me through the hardest months of the year. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't watching anyone's face to gauge whether I'd embarrassed them. I wasn't managing anyone's comfort at the expense of my own. I was simply present entirely myself at a table that finally belonged only to the people who valued being there. Ryan's mother still sends me a Christmas card every year, a small gesture I've come to appreciate more than I expected to. Last year's card included a single handwritten line beneath her usual greeting: "You deserved better than what happened at that table." I don't think of that Christmas dinner as the moment I defeated Ryan, though I understand why it might look that way from the outside. I think of it instead as the moment I stopped protecting a marriage that only I seemed willing to fight for. I remember sometimes the exact words Ryan said to me that December evening, standing in our kitchen, dish towel in my hand. "My ex is joining us for Christmas dinner, don't embarrass me." I told him, of course. And I kept that promise completely. I didn't raise my voice that night. I didn't throw anything, didn't humiliate Claire in front of strangers, didn't reveal a single secret before it's time. I simply opened the door for the one person who made it impossible for Ryan to keep lying. He did the rest himself. If you've made it this far, I imagine you have your own story tucked away somewhere, a moment when you finally stopped being polite for someone else's comfort and started being honest for your own sake. I'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight and what that moment looked like for you. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. And if stories like this one speak to you, consider subscribing because there are so many more waiting to be told. And I'd hate for you to miss the next one. Thank you for sitting with me through this and for letting Emma's table be a place you returned to one more time.